Good morning, Metalheads here, and welcome to a new episode of the Metal Meltdown, and today we're looking at the latest album from Fit For An Autopsy entitled The Sea of Tragic Beasts. This is the band's fifth studio album, and while I'm not necessarily a huge fan of some of their early material, it'd be pretty stupid of me to deny that they were probably putting out some of the most consistent and the most brutal deathcore in the early 2010s. What felt repetitive and forgetful in the hands of By Order's Murder and Whitechapel became something a lot more fierce, a lot more dynamic, and a lot more empowering in the hands of Fit For An Autopsy, particularly when you get to their fourth studio album, The Great Collapse, which saw the band going into much more progressive territory, not just musically, but also lyrically and aesthetically. Suddenly they were less concerned about pounding your skull into fucking dust and more concerned with the state of the earth itself, the environment, Native American populations, how we treat both respectively, making it not just the band's most ambitious album at that point, but probably one of the more ambitious records to come out of any deathcore band. Now, since the release of Great Collapse, a lot of other deathcore bands have gone out of their way to really change things up as far as their attitude, as far as their lyrics, their music, and their general presentation is concerned. Take, for instance, Whitechapel, who earlier this year went into much more personal territory, lyrically speaking, on their record The Valley, or for that matter, take a look at the recent record from Carnifex, which took away a lot of the deathcore tripe and traded in for a lot of influence from death metal, black metal, and adopted a kind of apocalyptic concept album vibe. I bring all of this up to illustrate the point that deathcore is changing quite fast. Fit For An Autopsy are no longer inherently the genre's most ambitious band. They really gotta start stepping things up if they intend to compete with these other bands, and for that matter, if they intend to retain their status as a top gun in this genre. And to be honest, that's part of why I'm actually a little bit disappointed with The Sea of Tragic Beasts. There's a lot of great material on here, don't get me wrong. Everything that made The Great Collapse remains. The ambition, the drive, the environmentally conscious lyrics, the politically progressive aesthetic of the record, the hard-hitting atmosphere, that's all there. But to me, it's just not nearly as fresh or as exciting. More than willing to accept right off the bat that I could be in the minority here. I've seen plenty of super insanely positive reviews, and for the record, there's definitely way worse music you get attached to, so I won't argue with you. Ultimately, I can only speak for myself, and the reality is I'm just not feeling it the way the rest of y'all are. As I said, though, still a lot of great stuff. Also, as I said, everything that made The Great Collapse such a strong record still remains, and in some aspects, they have indeed improved and expanded upon it. The general aesthetic and vibe of the record, for instance, is very poetic, cinematic, melodramatic. The songs don't play out like skull-bashing statements the way that we expect from this band, or for that matter from other deathcore bands. They are quite dense, multi-layered. It feels like a series of allegories and concepts wrapped together in a nice, pretty, story-like fashion. Take, for instance, a track like Shepherd, which in particular stands out as one of the densest songs lyrically speaking. How ultimately whatever happens is going to be our fault, pointing the finger at mankind, pointing the finger at how we haven't taken care of the world, how we haven't taken care of each other, even going as far as to say that we're all somewhat lambs to the slaughter. We're all followers to some extent. With lyrics such as, "The shepherds kill their sheep just to watch them die. The end of days is born under the burning sky. 1,000 oceans spill upon the spoiled shores, returning cities to the sea, all as it was before." As the track continues, it gets bleaker and bleaker and even brings to mind some of the darkest and most politically conscious moments of more modern cattle decapitation. Take, for instance, this particular verse. "Now we compete with bird and beast, cycles of deceit doomed to repeat. Sorrow we seed in to an earth I once believed in, a future stained in the blood of our children." Title track Sea of Tragic Beasts doesn't paint quite the same bleak and tragic picture of Shepherd, but make no mistake, it is still every bit as dark and troubling. With a chorus that reads, "These tragic beasts suffer eternally, the sad circus of humanity. Remove your wings, rise from the sea, and fall in the fire with me." Almost embracing a total failure of Mother Nature itself in the end. Just the band saying, fuck it, we failed. That's it, we're done. If this is how it is, then that's how it is. The band also does a good job at still handling the more introspective aspects that we do somewhat expect from this genre without devolving into pure bloodthirsty fucking carnage in the vein of a band like Carnifex. Take for instance tracks like Mirrors and Your Pain Is Mine. In both tracks, the band seems somewhat emotionally lost and confused. But in the former track, it's more out of loss and heartbreak, whereas in the latter, it's a lot more blatant and embracing. Lyrically and aesthetically, there's not an element I really dislike on this record, and all the performances are incredibly solid. I particularly love how emotive these vocals are. My problems begin to emerge within the actual instrumentation itself. The band, in their attempt to sound a lot more progressive and politically conscious and progressive, have ended up sounding like the deathcore version of Gojira. The aforementioned Sea of Tragic Beasts is perhaps one of the most obvious examples of this. The opening riff feels ripped straight from the most recent Gojira record, and even the use of cleans reminds me of some of the stuff that we heard on L'Enfant Sauvage. And that's not the only one either. Another track we just talked about, Mirrors, honestly does feel like it could have very well been on the Ways of All Flesh. As does another track like No Man Is Without Fear. It really does start to feel a lot like Gojira simply being channeled through deathcore. Now, to be fair, this doesn't make any of the tracks bad. In fact, the track we just talked about is probably one of the most entertaining and enthralling cuts on the record, musically speaking. But I do think it lacks the band of some of their individuality, their charisma, their originality. Suddenly, I don't feel like I'm listening to a Fit For An Autopsy record. Suddenly, I feel like I'm listening to Diet Gojira. It's very similar to the most recent Spirit Adrift record, which suffered from almost the exact same problem. But the difference was, on Divided by Darkness, Spirit Adrift was just trying to play some cool fucking heavy metal. Here, Fit For An Autopsy is trying to make a legitimate statement. And it's backfired to a point where I can't help but wonder if they're just starting to rip off Gojira entirely, aesthetically and musically. There's really only a couple tracks that don't really fall into this trap, in my opinion, but these tracks ultimately still suffer from just inherently being the more generic cuts of the record. Take, for instance, Your Pain Is Mine, which honestly sounds like it could have been a B-side to anything off the most recent As I Lay Dying record. Or a track like Unloved, which is just kind of monotonous and doesn't really go anywhere. In the end, I will give this a 3 out of 5, but to be honest, not the most enthusiastic 3 out of 5. I still did get a lot of enjoyment out of this. I still did enjoy a lot of the songs. I still did enjoy a lot of the performances and a lot of the lyrics. But I do think that the band have lost a little bit of their power and identity on this record. It just really doesn't hit as hard as Great Collapse, and ultimately suffers from trying to sound way too much like Gojira. That's not to say you still can't enjoy this record, mind you, especially if you're a Gojira fan. I mean, it's very unlikely that we'll see a Gojira record within the next year, so next best thing right here. For that matter, I don't really picture this being a particularly divisive record among the Fit For An Autopsy fan base. In fact, I've read plenty of reviews with people saying this could be the deathcore album of the year. Maybe with that in mind, like I said, I just have to accept that I'm in the minority, and if that's the case, then so be it. I honestly have no issue with that whatsoever. But ultimately, I still feel like Great Collapse was a stronger record lyrically, musically, and aesthetically. This, by comparison, just feels like a really huge creative step back, to the point where I'm honestly debating going lower. But again, I will acknowledge that there are some great performances on here and still some fantastic bits of songwriting. So again, 3 out of 5, but also again, probably not the most enthusiastic 3 out of 5. Just saying. And that is it for the Metal Meltdown. I'm not an expert, nor do I claim to be, so what do you think? Do you like this record? Do you not like this record? And what do you want to hear from me next? Thank you for watching. Make sure you press subscribe so you get updates on the Metal Meltdown fucking immediately. And you have yourself a fantastic fucking day.